Hello everyone, welcome back to this course on making your first info screen in React. Uh, Last episode we made our first component for the info screen that picks up the top dad joke of the day from Reddit, which is clearly a vital part of any info screen that would be used in real life. As you can see from the screen right now, I'm recording this on the day after I recorded the last couple of episodes, and as such, the dad joke of the day has changed, which kind of proves that our API approach works. So let's see what we're about to do today. Today we're gonna make another component, which will look at something maybe more useful for our info screen purposes, but while it's not as fun. So what we did yesterday is focus on this sort of traditional API approach where we create a request that we send to the server. Let's take a look at the code again, just to remind ourselves, where we create this request here that we send out to the server and we get some sort of response. This is one way of making a request to other servers, and it's very commonly used, but we combine it with some other techniques in many cases. One of the limitations of this approach is that this part here at the end, where we have these parameters that we send in that decide kind of the details of what we want of our data, they can get pretty complex at sometimes, and that can be complicated to deal with. So then, to deal with that sort of thing, we have some tools that we're going to look at in this episode. But before we do that, let's get started with making the new component. One of the things that's super nice about structuring your code in these sorts of components is that now that we're done with this dad jokes thing and we know that it works, we can just close that file down and never look at it again. Maybe if we need to update something, we'll look at it, but for now, it only exists as this thing here, and we know it works. So let's look at the next thing we're gonna make. And what I was very interested in when I first made this info screen was that I was using a lot of these city bikes that we have in Trondheim, where I lived at the time and where I still live. And they have these stations that sometimes they can be full of bikes, and sometimes there can be no places available to park your bikes, and that was a little bit frustrating. And sometimes I would have to go. So I wanted to get some sort of overview when I left my apartment of what are the conditions of these things. And luckily, we have a tool for that in Norway. We have a state-owned company called Entur. Entur means one trip. It owns the ticketing of all public transport in Norway. So you might have local providers of different services like buses, but over at some point the company that sort of owns public transport in Norway is called Entur. It's this combination company. This whole system of who owns what becomes very complicated, and we don't really care. What we do care about is that Entur, it provides a very robust API where you can get information about public transport almost no matter where you are in Norway, which is super useful to us because then we can build against one standard and not build specific things for around for where we are. So what you're looking at right now is the documentation page for the Entur SDK, or the software development kit. An SDK is what I'm talking about when I'm saying another way of interacting with these APIs. So the SDK is sort of in the same way that React is a bunch of JavaScript code that someone wrote to make painting things to the screen and updating web apps easy. An SDK is a wrapper around a certain API. So in this case, Entur also provides an API that works sort of like the one we used from Reddit, but it can become very complicated because Entur is they provide some very complicated information. So instead, they've been very kind to create this JavaScript package for us, which automatically creates these requests that we need, and that's super useful. So if you want to check out more interesting more discussions of why you should use it and why you shouldn't, they have this tiny explanations here on their webpage. And this documentation page also tells us really everything we need to do to use it. But before we get into the weeds with the SDK, let's get the component set up. So let's go back into the code and remember when we are making a component, we create a new file. And this file we're going to call bikes in this case because I'm going to use it to learn city bikes. And we get this empty file. And just like last time, we want to import React like that, and we want to create our function. I remember that our component in the end is a function, and it's going to be called bikes because we called it the same thing. It's not going to take any parameters. It's going to have a function body like that. And then, just like last time, I'm going to start by returning just the word bikes so that we can see that it works. And again, remember, now it's grayed out the name of the function, which means we aren't using it anywhere. So we need to remember to export the function. We do that by exporting bikes as default, just by writing export default bikes. And now we have a working component. So let's include it in our app by going back into app.js. And either above or below dad jokes, we will write bikes. And now I forgot to import it, so we gotta scroll up to the top here and import bikes from /bikes. And you can see this format is exactly the same as importing the last one. And this app component should still be pretty easy to read. So basically, we have all our dad joke stuff, and then we have all our bike stuff. So let's take a look at the web app and see how it works. And here's my web app, and see, now we have the text bikes here. So that's nice, and it just shows up below the other component, and it worked just like we wanted. Okay, so let's look at the SDK, because now we're gonna create this thing. So the very useful thing about Entur and many other APIs are the documentation is very well developed. So we can go into getting started because that's what we want to do right now. And they have these instructions on how you create your thing. We're not going to look at it in detail because I already know how to do this, but you can scroll through this if you want to. So we're first going to take this line here, and let me explain that before I do it. This is a typical line to see in modern web development. It might seem a little bit Greek to someone who's not used to it, but remember when we started our web app way back when, we wrote npm start. And npm is, as I've mentioned before, Node Package Manager, and it's how we interact with these external packages. So obviously, right now, what we want to do is install an external package. So you write in npm install, and this here at entur/SDK, which is the name of the package. The -- save at the end here we don't actually need. It's just something they write to be explicit and make it completely clear what we want to do. But let's just copy paste what they say we should use, and that's fine. So now we go back into our terminal to use this line, and we have this window here where we have our web server running. And you'll see you can write stuff now, but it doesn't do anything. And that's because right now this terminal isn't running the normal terminal. It's running your web server and your web app. So we need to stop that web app to be able to install something. And we do that by pressing Control-C. And you see that that's indicated by this little symbol here. And then we get back this line here. Yours might say something else. I told you that I have a custom terminal that provides me with a lot of cool colors and that sort of stuff. And this information here might not show up in your terminal, but it should show you some sort of indicator that you have a line where you can write stuff again. And now we can write ls like we used to see the files and that sort of stuff. But importantly, we can paste in our actually copy that thing. Let's go back and copy this thing. We can copy this and paste that into our page. And if you can't paste in some operating systems, pasting and copying into the terminal can be a little bit complicated. You could just write out the text, and you press enter, and now npm will take care of all of the installing these files. And we just have to wait a little bit and look at it go. So there's a bunch of warnings and everything here, and we don't need to care about that. This is mostly warnings for the people who are creating this thing, so maybe they should update some stuff, but it's usually not a problem, and especially not when it's not a product that we're gonna like be selling to someone or something like that. But this is completely normal. And it takes a little bit of time. Usually the reason this takes a lot of time is because this Enter SDK is quite large. It's relying on other packages and that sort of thing. And this is kind of how modern web development works. We just build on each other's work constantly, and we have these dependency trees that we end up with. So now we're just waiting here, and I'm babbling to wait for it to work. I'm just going to be looking at it for a while. I guess while this is working, we can take a little bit more of a look at the documentation. So I already told you that we want to look at the bike section, and that's what we want to do. But before we do that, I'm just going to show you that they have a lot of other interesting stuff. So travel is are their tools for like planning your travel. If you've used one of these mobile apps for Router or for whatever they're called in your city, you can usually have like a travel planning. I think that's this one. Departures shows you when buses and trains and that sort of stuff leaves. And then we have scooters, which is quite new. And then it's these electric scooters that you find around Norway now. Many of them are also on this API, but they don't have all of them yet. But we want to use this bikes part. So we can expand this, and then we can see what functions we have available on this API. Let's click one of them because actually, so we can see we have either the function get bike rental station, and we have get bike rental stations, and then we have get bike rental stations by position. So get bike rental station, it's basically you have to have their ID, and you can get information about one specific station. We don't have that idea, so we don't really want this function. If you go to the next one, it's kind of the same thing. It's just you have to give it a list of or an array of ideas, and it'll show you the information for all of them. That's also interesting, but not what we want. What we really want is we only know where we are, so we want this position attribute. So in this case, we can read from the documentation here that this takes this coordinates object, which has latitude and longitude, and it returns and it takes a distance, which is the radius at which it should search for stations, and it returns to us all the bike rental stations that we want. And that's a little bit complicated, but I'll show you how it works. Let's take a look at our terminal again and see. Now we can see that it's done because we have this line again, and that's perfectly fine. So before we move on, we have to restart our web server, which we do by writing npm start again, just like we did a couple of episodes ago. And then that should spin back up, and let's see if it works. And that's usually pretty fast. And this worked fine, and nothing new has happened here because there's nothing new happening yet. But if we go take a look at our code, we can see a change in this file called package.json. So I told you about package.json briefly earlier. It is the package. It's the file that in many ways describe our project and its settings. And the most important settings block right now is this dependency section. And you'll notice that at the top here, we've added a new dependency to this Entur package, and that's exactly what we wanted. So now we can start using that. Let's go back into our bikes document and see if we can't get something interesting out of this. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to import this. Actually, let's go back into the explanation page because they have more explanations here. Going back into getting started, we can see there's more stuff here. It says after you've installed it, you should do the setup. And that includes an import line, which is pretty useful because then we don't need to look up what this thing is called. So let's go back in here, paste the import line in. Now we have this. See, it's grayed out because we don't use it yet. And let's look at what the next thing we're doing. We are not using common.js. We are just using the standard way of doing it in React. And they have this policy that you have to create this service beforehand, and this varies from SDK and API to API. It changes depending on how they've built their tool. So you usually need to look at one of these getting started pages to figure it out. But we basically need to copy paste this line, and put that in here. So we need this service. We can put it in here inside our function. Actually, we need to put it outside of our component. Basically, we're putting it outside because this thing re-renders all the time. It's called many times in the lifetime, and we don't really need that. We just want this service to exist one time. And then we should update our client name. This is just a name that they use to identify you by, but it's part of their policy that we need to have a name. So we should do it because we're using a tool they've created. So I'm just going to call my company Aslak because that's my name. And then I'm going to call my app info screen. And that's all we need for that section. Let's see if there's more stuff to do here. There's some configuration details. We don't really need to care about that because we're just using the basic default things. And then there's an explanation of how it could work. We're not going to look at that because I've already prepared something that looks a little bit more simple. So that's all we need from this page. Let's go back into our code. So first we want to make a call to this thing, and from the last episode we know that we need a use effect if we want to make a call in the same way that we did in our last thing. So we need to import use effect and create a use effect in here, and we're going to do that same format that we used last time, this kind of strange format where we have the use effect as a function that takes an anonymous function with the parentheses and the fat arrow, and then the function body followed by the comma and the empty array. And let's just console log in here first so that we know that everything works. Hello. That's what I'm writing. Okay, let's check it out. Make sure nothing's crashed. Go back into here. We see hello over here. That's good. And it's also complaining about the fact that we're not using these tools, and that's absolutely correct. We haven't started using them yet. Okay, so let's make a call to this service. So earlier we used the fetch function to make a call. And that's how you make these default calls where you just put a new URL in. But we now have this service tool, and the service tool includes this fetch call, so we don't need to use that. So we are going to use some sort of function that exists inside of this package of so service is all this code that they've created for us, and if we want to call a function that exists in that code, we just write service and dot, and then you can see right away my editor is smart enough to understand that there are a bunch of functions inside of this service package, and we can pick them and autocomplete by them. And I already told you that we want this get bike rental station by position, so I just scroll down to that and press enter, and we get it. And then let's go back into the documentation for this part. Now we've not finished our code yet, so it's crashing, but let's go into the bikes and get bike rental station by position, and we can see the parameters that this function has to take. It takes a coordinates object that looks like this with the comma, latitude number, and the longitude number, and it takes a distance number. So let's get that written in. That means we need these parameters, and actually my editor is also telling me what these things are, but it's a little bit more confusing in here, so I usually like to look at the documentation if it's available. So first thing we needed was an object, which we write in JavaScript with these curly brackets, and that object has two values. It has a latitude and a longitude, and now we just need some numbers for latitude and longitude, which correspond to a physical position on the globe. In my case, I have picked the latitude and longitude of my old apartment. I don't live there anymore, so I don't feel like it's a problem putting that out into the world. But it's I highly recommend that you use the same values that I have for testing now, and then later you can change it to your local position. But the thing is that I have tested this, and I know that there are bike stations close to this position. And then I also added this 230, which means 230 meters, and that's just a value that I could have picked 500, but I happen to know that there are just a couple of bike stations within 230 meters, and if I go further beyond that, there's suddenly tons of bike stations, and I didn't really want all of them. So if you use these values, you'll get some decent results, and you don't have to worry about it failing because there simply aren't any bike stations nearby. Okay, and then we need to do something with this value, of course, and that works the same way that it did when we used the fetch. That we write then this function of what we happen whenever this is done, and that takes a data, or we give it a data. The same thing where we give it an anonymous function, and then let's console log the response that we get, just like we did last time. Okay, so you remember that last time we had to convert this thing to JSON and all that sort of stuff before we could do anything with it. But this time the service handles all that stuff for us, so we don't need to worry about that. But let's go back into our app and see what the console log says. So here we can see the console log. It's returned to us an array with 4 objects, and these objects are related to the 4 closest bike stations to my old apartment. And it gives us a lot of interesting info. Specifically gives us this info for bikes available and spaces available, which is super useful. You might see that in on this API right now, all of them have 0 bikes available and or all their spaces available, and that's simply because I'm recording this in early January and it's out of season. So they've probably put all their bikes in a warehouse over Christmas, so that they aren't damaged by the winter conditions in Trondheim. But when during summer or when the season's up, this would reflect however many bikes would be available at that current time. So this is exactly what we wanted. Let's go back into the code again now. So just like last time, we need to store this data somewhere so that we can work with it, because we don't really want to just console log it. We want it to be in our front end, and we'll do that by importing the use state hook, just like we did last time. And this is the same as last time. We want to create this hook that we want, or the state that we want, which we do with this slightly strange syntax. And let's call it bike stations, because that's what they are, and set bike stations, and then use states. And in this case, last time we had an empty object, but now we know that this thing returns an array with objects in it. So let's just give it an empty array as a default value. And then we can use this set bike stations function in here to set the bike stations. And then just like last time, I'm gonna, for testing, create a use effect that will console log the value of bike stations whenever bike stations is updated. And this is just for testing bike stations. Here we go. Okay, let's take a look at the browser again and see if we understand what's going on. Oh, I have made a mistake. Oh no, I haven't made a mistake. I just was a little bit fast at refreshing. Okay, so nothing's happened in the front end part of it yet, or the visual part, but in the console log we still have the list printed, and we can also see that it printed the empty list before it finished the request, and then reprinted it when the values was updated, which is exactly what we wanted. Good stuff. Let's take a little bit of a look at how we should display this information. So the interesting thing now is that we now have a list of these objects, and we have this one bikes object, but what we really need is we need a way to. We don't want to build a component that displays this list of 4 stations, because that's not general. We want to build a component that can take a list of bike stations and build one component for each bike station. So let's start by creating that sort of looping function that we need through our code. And we can do that by converting this return function. And I'm just gonna, let's say, 1 to 1. And then I'm gonna say, 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 and then I'm g make some room here. We're still gonna have it inside this div. I'm gonna actually give it a class name like I did last time because I forgot, and it's gonna be called bikes. I like to have small letters for my things like that. And then now we've cleaned it up a little bit. So what we need now is we need some JavaScript. So again, we're gonna have these curly brackets, and then we need. Actually, let's do it like that. And then we need to do some interesting stuff. We need to do a loop over a list. And if you've done some programming, you're familiar with loops. In JavaScript, we can do that in many ways. But the cleanest way of doing it, in my opinion, is to use something called a map. And for a map, first we write a list. And in this case, we use the list bike stations, which we've created up here. And we write .map. And map is a function. It's a little bit specific. What it basically does is it loops over all elements in a list and it executes another function on each element. So what we want right now is that we want to give it a function. Let's say it takes it gets some sort of station data. So that's basically, since bike stations contains a lot of data for different stations. Actually, let's just call it, let's call it station data. That anonymous function we're creating right now, it returns a function body, or actually, it just console logs the station data. Let's do that at first so we can see what's happening. Here we go. So now we have this that the rendering the return function here, instead of writing the text bikes, it now makes this code which is console log something. So if we look back here, we can see bikes is gone, but actually let me refresh so I have clean here. But we can see that these we now have individual console logs for each of these things, and that's good. That's what we wanted. Before we move on, let's clean up some of the other stuff so that we don't have it so much messy. Let's remove this console log, and let's move this use effects. Here we go. Now get it cleaner. And now we want something interesting to happen in here. So what I'm going to do now is that instead of writing explicitly what I want here, we're going to use the same technique that we've done when creating these function components to create another function, which will handle exporting this sort of stuff. And it's done basically the same thing. I've told you before that we usually make new files for new components, but right now I'm going to write the component in the same file because we can totally do that. So let's create a new function. There you go. This function is going to be called station because it represents one station and not the entire concept of bikes in our app, or bike stations. It's going to take no arguments. It's going to have a function body like normal, and it's just going to return a div. Let's give it a class name, which is station, and that class and inside of here, let's just call it write station for now. This is just the simplest way. Since we are only using this this component inside this file, we don't need to export this function. So that's super useful. So let's just take station, and instead of returning this console log inside this file, let's return the station component. And it's written just like a normal component would be in the app file. And let's see now what we have in our code. And now we can see since we know we have four stations, and for every station we have this station thing. You'll see here that we have this warning that shows up, and we'll deal with that very soon. But first, let's talk about props in React. And props is one of the other interesting concepts. For now, we've created components that are completely self-sufficient, that are standing on their own legs. So, for example, the dad jokes component, it doesn't understand anything about the rest of our app, but it just gets this dad joke and puts it out on the screen, and then that's its entire job, and that's fine. But in this case, we want to communicate between two components, and that's the concept of props. So how we do that in React is we write props in the declaration of the component, sort of like we would attributes in normal HTML elements. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create this prop called data, and into data we're going to send the station data. And then we need to access that on the other side here, and we do it by writing props in here. This basically says, okay, this function, it will take a parameter called props, and then React will handle all of the mapping of this sort of format to this sort of format. That just handled for us. And we say that inside of this props object, we will have an object called data. And this, you'll see this format is sort of like the format that we use up here, except that props is an object, so we need to have curly brackets instead. So this data, let's just first console log it so that we know that everything is working as intended. Okay, and then go back and see what's happening here. Let's refresh. We see station here like normal, and then we see that just like before, we have these things logged. And that's all of the stuff that we want. And now we need to do something with these things. So obviously, we don't want all of the data. We just want a couple of the fields. So we could, for example, log station name, because that's what we want. Log all of it that we want. We want station name. We want bikes available, and we want spaces available. Those are the what is it called? Spaces available. Here we go. I just thought it would autocomplete, but it didn't. Let's make sure that that's correct by going back into the thing here. We need to refresh. See, there's something that isn't correct, because we have successfully logged the names. They're fine, but for the second parameter we have undefined, and that means that I have written something wrong in this function. What did I write? I wrote bike stations, and that's not what this attribute is called. So okay, let's solve this the way I would if I didn't immediately know what was wrong, because I've done this before. But let's write console log data again, so that we can look at what the data looks like and compare. So let's refresh, and we can see here. And then we look at these files, and we see, okay, name, that's correct. Spaces available, that's what I wrote. But here we see bikes available and not bike stations. I just did a little mistake in my head. So obviously we need the name bike stations, and bikes available. Sorry. So let's just change that out. Bikes available. Let's delete this console log again and go back and see if it works now. Refresh, and we have here successfully gotten all the values. Obviously these are 0, but that's because it's winter. But we have values, and that's what we want. So that's useful. Now let's move it into the render function, and that works just like we've done before. At this point, we want inside of our div, we want some JavaScript. Because we want the first thing we want is the name. So we write data.name, and then let's have a colon after the name. This is just how it will look, and then we have the data.bikes available that we have over there. And let's use a dash to indicate the second part. And then we have data.stations available. Spaces available. Again, I've mistaken. There we go. Now we will render a string inside of this div that will look sort of like this. Let's take a look at what it looks like. And here we have this interesting thing. And this, now you can see how we have actual value in our component. We have this name of the station, how many bikes is available, and how many spaces are available. Let's clean some stuff up before we finish this episode by removing this console log. Seeing, oh yeah, I've already cleaned some stuff up, so that's fine. So for this episode, we've talked about how SDKs are very useful, because they provide us functions that basically create these complicated queries to an API for us, so we don't need to do it ourselves. We've revisited the concept of hooks in state hooks and these use effect hooks that we have here. We've also looked at how we could map over an array to create new objects. And we've looked at how we can pass information between two different components. And I just realized I promised you that we would also solve this error, and let's do that. So this error comes from the fact that React really wants something called a key property. And it's basically just an identifier that React uses whenever they have a list of things, so that they can uniquely identify everything. And that's very important. You can get some strange mistakes. And it's pretty simple. We just write key in here, and that's a default parameter that all React components have. And we have to give it some sort of unique value. And for this case, we know that we have a unique value in the station data.name, because the names are unique. Actually, we also have some more unique values, but let's just use the station name data.name right now. If we go back, refresh, we should no longer have an error. And that's perfect. That is that component cleaned up and finished up. And those are the two basic components that I figured I would show you for this course. And the next episode, we'll be looking at how to publish this thing online. So stay tuned for that.